What's up, everybody? Welcome to a brand new episode of the Wise Builders Podcast. And I'm your host, Mark Casto. And today I have an amazing conversation that I cannot wait to share with you from a new friend, George Bryant. He's an amazing individual. This conversation is deep, it is powerful from a heart perspective and the soul of a man, all the way to talking about how knowing who you are and having a right mindset affects your business. This is a must hear conversation. But before I jump into that, let me just tell you we are building a world class community called Wise Builders Business Community. Right now, we are releasing courses on everything from how to pick a niche, how to create an ebook, even if you're not a writer, how to launch digital courses, how to launch communities online, to marketing and sales secrets, everything that you need, A to Z, start to finish, on digital products and online business. We're building a community where you can learn to do that. If you'd like more information about the community that we're building and you'd like to be a part, we would love to have you in our community. Just look at the link in our description below. Get signed up today. We've got amazing things to offer you inside. So, to jump back to this conversation, I just want to do a brief introduction of my friend. His name is George Bryant. This man and this conversation is going to change your life. He's a New York Times bestselling author, top ranking podcast host of his podcast called The Mind of George. It's an amazing podcast, and he's a highly sought after digital marketing expert. You're going to hear a lot of his testimony today, the years that he searched for someone to tell him who he was, and his journey of finding home. And so it's an amazing story because you're going to hear how money didn't fix his problems, and he went on a journey of seeking the Lord through many different ways. And about 6 months ago, he gave his life to Christ. It's an amazing testimony. I can't wait for you to jump in and see everything that's going on in this podcast, for you to meet my new friend, George. I'm telling you guys, this conversation is absolutely going to change your life. So, without further ado, let's jump in to this amazing conversation with my friend, George Bryant. Man, I am super excited to have on the Wise Builders podcast today a new friend, George Bryant. Man, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Oh, bro, I feel like I made a best friend before we hit record. So like, I'm honored to be here, man. Like I'm in. Like, consider me in for anything you need, anytime.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, this was a really quick turnaround because I had actually did a podcast last week with Jen Maria, and I just asked her, I was like, is there anybody out there that you feel like I need to connect with? And immediately she sent your name, and I was like, looked up your stuff, and I was like, yep, absolutely. Then you messaged me back on Instagram and was like, I'm sitting here with my son, want to reach out to, I'm like, okay, Annie's a dad. Here we go. This is going to be a great conversation. So yeah, man, I'm excited for you to be on the podcast. There's a lot of things that we could talk about. I've done my homework on you and getting to know you and see your journey, your story on Instagram. And I wanted to ask you to share your journey from, like, okay, you're a Marine, then you become a food blogger, and now marketing expert. Like, can you share just a little bit
Yeah.
of how you got through those wildly different avenues?
Yeah, man. And there's a lot underneath it to unpack, but for the sake of everybody listening, since you didn't sign up for a 3-day seminar on a podcast, I will share the abridged version. But yeah, it didn't even really start as a Marine. So it started early on in my childhood. I had a pretty broken home. There was drug abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. And so I was basically on my own from like 13 on. And the reason I joined the Marine Corps was to actually run away. Like, I never had this goal or aspiration to be a Marine. Truthfully, there was something inside of me, which you'll understand as your previous, like your current life of, I explain it to people that I don't understand how I was 14 years old living in like what I couldn't really understand, but how I had this calling in my heart to not end up like that. And I can only say it was God. And so when I joined the Marine Corps, it was to prove to myself that I could do hard things. And then it was kind of an escape. And so I went and joined the Marine Corps, spent 13 years on active duty. My whole goal was to do 20 years and then retire and hand out smiley face stickers at Walmart. Like, and I'm, as much as I wish I was joking, That
That's
was the
real.
only vision I had for my life. And I was like, I'll do 20 years, I'll get retirement, I'll do blank. I didn't have a family. I didn't want a family. I was like, this is my home. It was structure. It was a family that I never had. I didn't realize they, it turned my brokenness into being an effective, Marine. And then throughout my career, I almost lost both my legs in Somalia in 2005 and told I'd never walk again. They wanted to amputate them, ended up relearning how to walk, made a full recovery, and then did 9 more years on active duty. And then in Afghanistan, I basically had like 7 traumatic brain injuries, 6 or 7 in like 2 or 3 years. And so at around like the 12-year mark, they're like, hey, we're going to be done with you. And I was blessed that in Afghanistan, I'd lost my father to cancer, who I didn't really have a close relationship with, but we ended up healing and becoming friends. And it kind of challenged me, because when I almost lost my legs and I was in a wheelchair, I attempted my life by overdosing because I just didn't get it and I couldn't deal with the pain anymore. And truthfully, I'm shocked that I woke up. And it was one of those, like, I know people throw it around, but it was one of my first come to Jesus moments, even though it took me till this year to fully commit my life to Christ. And in Afghanistan, I'd lost quite a few Marines to suicide and other things. And I came to the realization that I was too afraid to take my life, but I was slowly killing myself every single day and pretending that I wasn't. Like, I had never lived a day in my life. I'd been surviving for
Wow.
my entire life. And so it kind of sparked something in me. I struggled with bulimia. I was bulimic for like 16 years. It's how I coped with the stress. I would go purge in porta potties in Afghanistan, or go purge to try to have some semblance of control from sexual abuse as a kid.
Wow.
And I was blessed that the only gym we had in Afghanistan was a CrossFit gym. And so I started CrossFitting, which led me to paleo, which I started eating paleo, but I'd never cooked a day in my life. And when I came home from Afghanistan, paleo wasn't a thing in 2008, 2009, right? Like it was like early on. And I was like, I want to eat this way because I feel better, but I also need accountability so people don't know I'm trying to heal myself. And I was like, I'm going to start a blog. I didn't even know what it was, but I basically just started making a recipe while being a Marine and writing a story every day. But every time I would post it, it would hold me accountable to eating that way. And I felt like I was using the world as my accountability stick to not be bulimic anymore, because I had to do it myself, right? That's my whole story, like survival, like had to do it
Yeah.
myself. And so it was a big blessing, because after about 18 months of doing that, the Marine Corps is like, hey, we're done with you. And 13 years out, no retirement, like
Wow.
we're done. And so I kind of accidentally became an entrepreneur, and I didn't know anything about entrepreneurship. I never read books, never took courses. I just connected with people and basically did what they asked. And so I had been blogging consistently for, a year and a half. And then someone's like, you should make an ebook. And then my first digital product ever made $1 million. And
Wow.
then someone's like, you should write a cookbook. I'm like, I don't know how to do that. I'll figure that out. Found a publisher, and they're like, you'll never be a New York Times bestseller. And then I was a 22-week New York Times bestseller. And then someone's like, you should make an app. And I'm like, well, I'll figure that out too. And ended up launching an app and hit #1 in the world and got featured by Apple as the top health app of 2015. I had like 500,000 followers on each platform, 5 million people a month on my website, but it all came crashing down when I realized that I had no idea who I was. I'd never addressed any of the deep-rooted issues, none of the trauma, none of the PTSD, none of my childhood. And then I didn't know how to connect with people. My whole life was this illusion of social media. I had no level of
Wow.
intimacy or authenticity with anybody. And my ex-wife, who's the mother of my children, had basically been strong enough to put her foot down and like, you can't come back until you start doing work. Like, and so then that led me to personal development. That led me to plant medicine and MDMA assisted psychotherapy, which ultimately, like, short end of the story is like, that just spent 8 years leaving me to where I am now, which is with God, which would have been the way shorter stick, but made me quite useful as a tool.
Yeah. Yeah.
As like breath work, CBT, EMDR, plant medicine, psychedelics, ayahuasca, all of them, all leading me to the same place. But really, I had a moment when I was on that healing journey with plant medicine, and I realized that entire business was out of alignment with who I wanted to become. And I realized at 33 years old, 32 years old, that I'd never made a decision in my entire life for myself. It was always what everybody wanted. And I had clarity one night in an experience where I met God. And I was like, I have to give away this business in the next 24 hours. And no one said I should. My ex was like, no way. My coaches were like, you're bat crap crazy. And I'm like, you don't get it. Like, I don't care. And we were like 3 weeks away from bankruptcy. And I was like, I know. And so I made a phone call, and in 24 hours, I gave that entire business away to my buddy, Josh Trent, and everything. And I was like, I want nothing to do with it. I had no backup plan. I had nothing. And I would just sat there, and I felt free, but I also deleted social media, changed my phone number, changed my email, and just kind of disappeared. And literally magically, like the skin of my teeth, 2 weeks later, I get a phone call from my friend Sean Stevenson and Jim Quick. And they're like, hey, we miss you. You should come up to the house and hang out with us. We're doing like a little get together. And I walk into this room with like 22 entrepreneurs. I knew some of them, didn't know the rest. And it turned out to be a mastermind. And everyone's like talking about how great their life is and how great their business is. And I'm bawling my eyes out. And I'm like, I'm miserable. I'm having suicidal ideations. And none of them really even acknowledged me. And then somebody asked a business question. And I was like, that's the dumbest answer I've ever heard. I wouldn't do that. And they're like, what would you do? And I was like, well, I'll show you what I did. And I ended up teaching them for an hour how I had built and scaled that company. And then there were 22 people in the room, and 20 of them hired me. And I didn't even know you could consult or coach. I didn't know that.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so that's actually how I became like what I am today. And so then that led me to helping those people. And then a lot of them doubled and tripled their businesses in a matter of weeks and months. And so then all the brands that I had built relationships with when I was a food blogger were like, wait, what are you doing now? How did you do that? And then they called and they're like, will you help us? And that's how I helped scale 2 supplement companies to $1 billion and a couple more into the 9-figure range. And I lived that whole life of helping rich people get richer until I realized it cost me everything. And money is just an amplifier for who you really are, like alcohol. And I once again found myself in the bucket of wanting the status and wanting to be associated, except this time it was fully self-sacrificial because it didn't come back my way. And I got taught many lessons by God of being out of alignment where I was the first one on the chopping block. And so then it kind of softened me. And I was like, hey, it's time to go back on the internet and just help people. Like, I just miss helping people.
Wow.
And I took everything that I've learned and, spending $20 million in 1 month on Facebook ads of somebody else's money. And I was like, I'm just going to teach everybody for free and help them, which is where my podcast came from. And then if someone's like, I want more help, then of course I will work with you. But like, my job is to be a humble servant and to be a go-giver. And all those things I help the companies with were actually loving their customers and bringing heart back into business and helping people achieve the promises that we had. And so then it leads me to today where, I have a podcast and I'm working on this one, but God makes me remember it often, like results alone, like one of the best in the world at customer journey and marketing and relationships and mindset. And that's where I spend my time every moment of every day, whether it's for free and you listen to my podcast or on my Instagram or you come to my event. Like, my job is to be of service, and it genuinely is the only thing that makes me happy. And that's kind of how we got to here.
Man, I'm telling you, I was gonna ask you this, a minute ago, but I'm like, man, to go through what you went through, from a child to escaping to the Marine Corps, which is not an escape, it's a distraction. And another layer of trauma to that. Man, where in the world did you find this tenderness? That was the thing, man. If I could tell you anything, George, that was like, I gotta have this guy on my podcast, is anytime I find a Marine with tenderness, he's gone through a process.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so I mean, you're unpacking now that tenderness, and I love that you've had this ebb and flow of uh success, lay it down to find yourself, success, lay it down to find yourself. Because man, that is my journey. In 2015, at the height of like ministerial success, we bought 100 acres. We built a $23 million gathering place. We had thousands of people that, like, we had 200 families move from 26 different states to be a part of our church. And then thousands would come to the conferences and gatherings. And so I was only 25, 23, 24, 25 when this stuff is happening. And I remember being at the height of that when the Lord like asked me to lay this down. And he's like, Mark, you've been in ministry for years, but you don't even know who you are. So who is Mark without a pulpit and a microphone? And man, I went on this journey from 2015, and in many ways, obviously still on this journey of who is Mark, I want to be, more than being like successful in whatever field. It's like, I want to be an amazing husband. I want to be
Yeah.
an amazing dad. And I want to be known as someone who loved well. Like that's my whole story. And man, if you ask me, ministry and the Marine Corps, they kind of go hand in hand. Uh, there, it's a war zone in a lot of different ways. You go through the physical and psychological warfare of the Marine, but the spiritual, mental warfare that you go through as a pastor, as a leader, they can take similar tolls on the mind
Mhm.
and the body. And so it's just real interesting, man, to hear your story because I feel like, oh, it's almost like me too, like as
Yeah.
you're talking, it's like me too. I get it. Um, so like the tenderness is a big deal, but I also want to, if you don't mind talking about this, I would love
No.
for you to talk about the how the shamans kept you from the ayahuasca.
Yeah, so I was telling Mark before we started that it's really, really funny because if you look at it on paper, right, just for context, I would be considered a baby Christian by choice, where I rededicated my life to Christ by choice this time, 6 months ago. And I was baptized as a kid. And truthfully, Mark, that the part that I left out is that when I was a kid, the place that I used to hide when I was homeless was Christian youth group rooms because they never asked me questions. And I
Wow.
think about some of the most influential people that kind of silently supported me when I was a kid. And it was like God had his arms on me the whole time.
Wow.
And in this healing journey, I struggled. I struggled. Like I talk about it like it was nothing. But like those dark ages, like there was a 3-year period where I didn't get off the couch. I was 120 pounds heavier than I am now. I was like literally incapacitated, and I'd made enough money in business that I didn't have to do anything, which was a crux in its own. And I had done every therapy modality you could imagine. I had done years of psychology and EMDR. EMDR was effective. It was probably the thing that opened me up the most, that got me moving. But the prolonged exposure, the cognitive behavioral therapy, the cognitive processing therapy, like none of it worked. I was going to 12-step meetings, and it was basically like I was just ready to quit.
Wow.
And I had a therapist offer me MDMA assisted psychotherapy, which is basically ecstasy with a therapist. And it changed me in a good way because it was the first time I was ever able to feel and release my emotions without wanting to self harm. Because I used to self harm to deal with anger. Like I'd punch myself, I'd hit myself. And it opened up a lot of possibility. And then somebody I really admire and respect and trust was like, hey, listen, like they went through a similar situation to me. And they're like, I drank ayahuasca and it brought me home to God, but like I feel different. And it was something that I'd been around and I'd heard of, and it scared the crap out of me. And the first time I went down to Costa Rica, just so everybody can laugh at the story, I've been accused of being like new age and X and Y. And I had this incredible shaman. His name is Brad. I'm still friends with him to this day. And he is a man that I feel like, regardless of what your position or what your stance is on plant medicine, if it comes from the earth, if people should do it, if it's a false prophet, whatever, this man is one of the people who like led me to God, because I went and I showed up and I was like, hey, like I need this to fix my life. And he's like, I'm not letting you sit with this medicine. This is sacred. Like this is a gift from God. And he's like, this isn't your one-stop solution. Like this isn't an easy pill. And he's like, you're not allowed to do this. And I was like, ugh. And I started yelling and I was angry. And he's like, you can come back when you can answer this one question. And I was like, what's the question? And he's like, what's the purpose of your life? And I yelled again, and I was like using expletives. And I was like, do you know what I can do to you? Do you know like who I was such a wounded little boy. And he's like, I was like, where am I supposed to find that? And he's like, well, why don't you go to your room and come back when you have an answer? And I was yelling again. And he's like, your biggest problem is you've never been quiet enough to let God whisper. And it shifted something in me. And I went back to my room. And it took about 2 days. I went through every emotion you could imagine. I would call it, like, for lack of better terms, like an exorcism or a full somatic release. I was angry. I was crying. I was dry heaving. I was puking. Like I had no answer to this question. And I got so exhausted, I finally passed out. And the next morning I woke up And it was like God tattooed words on my soul. And I picked up a pen and all I wrote on the paper, and I will never forget this to this day. It's why my branding's a lighthouse, actually. Um, I wrote, "My purpose is to stand with structure in the face of resistance to create possibility."
Wow.
And it moved something in my body. And it made my whole life make sense. Like every up and down, every roller coaster, every traumatic event, all the injuries, the blood, the bullets, the broken teeth, the concussions. And I was like, okay. And then he let me sit with the medicine that night. And I did partake over the next 3 years, 16 times. And the more I did, the closer I became to God. And I had a very long journey home to God because of my ego and my survival instinct to want to control everything. Because faith and surrender is probably the biggest muscle I had to learn how to flex. And it really, really changed me. But, to close the loop, the reason my branding is a lighthouse and the reason I teach what I teach is because of what I wrote on that paper 11 years ago. And it's comical because, of all people, it was a shaman who dishes out plant medicine that kind of started my journey home. And yeah, I do find it comical. Most of the people I share it with laugh a bit as well. But yeah, that's kind of where that came from.
Yeah, it's amazing. I know some of the people watching this podcast are going, "Mark, what in the world are you doing? Like, you've been a pastor all these years, and now all of a sudden you've got this new age guy on here." I'm like, "No, you didn't hear his story. That's how it started."
Mm-hmm.
And 6 months ago, you give your life to Christ, but I just love that your journey started with this shaman that's like, "No, you're not ready for this. You gotta
Mm-hmm.
find out who you are. You gotta
Mm-hmm.
find out," you know, I just think that's really cool. And, I told you this before the podcast. One of the most powerful, because we get really dogmatic about how people find the Lord.
Yep.
And I always say 2 things. Number 1, um, you never accidentally bump into God. Everybody that I know that has had an encounter with the Lord, it came with a great deal of intentionality, whether they were Muslim, they were Hindu, they were New Age, or even people that grew up in Christian church their entire life. There came a moment where the sincerity of their heart was, "I need to know what's real. I
Mm-hmm.
need to know him. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
can't deny that there's something more than me, and I gotta find out who my creator is." And there's this intentionality that goes with it. So, when you like, everybody likes to use the Apostle Paul as, like, the big icon of, like, this man was a murderer, and now he's writing 2/3 of the New Testament talking about loving your neighbor and all, just really set the tone for the early church. And I'm like, but you do realize that he didn't meet Jesus through Christianity. He actually met Jesus through trying to be as faithful as he possibly could through Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same thing with Muslim friends that I have now. Deep devotion to God, deep devotion, and then all of a sudden they meet a man dressed in white with with holes in his hands, and his name is Isa. And it's like, you can go story after story of these people that are on this journey. I've got to know him, and they find him with great intentionality, because the scriptures are clear. When you will search for me, and you will find me when you search for me with your whole heart. Which
Mm-hmm.
leads me to my next part. Like, your story fits beautifully into this. Anybody that's read The Shack, you know what I'm talking about. In The Shack, Mac, the main character, is talking to the Lord, and he says to him, "So does this mean there's many ways to you, to God?" He said, "No, Mac, there's not many ways to me, but there's not any road I won't travel to get to you." And so, like, I'm sitting here listening to you tell your story, George, and I'm like, God knew you were intentional, you were after it, you were searching, and he's like, "There's not one road I won't travel to get to you." I think it's beautiful story, man. Beautiful
Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
I
And
love it.
I just want to say too, like, it's profound because, to what you shared earlier and even asking about the tenderness, the only time that I ever had the cry on my heart for God was in the darkest of moments, where I had a perspective of what evil and darkness really, really looked like.
Yeah.
And, like, the tenderness comes from living in the other side, right? Like, there's this understanding that I have in my body that I feel viscerally, like every day. And also like the damage that I caused people, not ill-intended, but because of the trauma, the anger and the sadness and the separation and the emotional abuse and the gaslighting and the narcissistic tendencies, because I was so scared and wounded and I didn't know where to go. I just ran and ran and ran and ran.
Wow.
And the only way I ever knew how to release it was to self-harm. Basically, I would work out too much or I'd be an entrepreneur too much. And it was because I never wanted to hurt anybody. My heart was pure. And the hardest part, and even when I wanted to take my life, it was because I didn't understand why I hurt people, because I love everybody.
Man.
And it's been a road, but the tenderness is like, I want everybody to feel the love of God and like the love of life. And I know truthfully in everything, like there was this, I committed my life to Christ this year, but it wasn't like instantaneously. Like I would pray to God in combat and I would say, God, help me. Like, God, help me. But I was lost. Like I didn't know what to do. And like I was even telling you before the show, people accuse me of like being new age and, having crystals and praying and using Palo Santo and boom, boom, boom. And they're like, oh, you're like false profiting. I'm like, no, I'm looking for daddy. Like I'm looking for my daddy.
That's right, man.
Like I didn't become a breathwork teacher because I wanted to breathe. I was trying to find meaning in something deeper. And it took all of those situations. And truthfully, man, and God would never do this, but what it felt like is I had to have my legs cut out of my ego every single time and on my knees until I realized that when it got to the lowest it had gotten, that none of the other ones were low. They were low for other people, but I'm like, compared to my childhood, no, my ego can get out of this. My mind can get me out of this. Like I'll work my way out of this. And then it was the core of it. It was my family unit, everything that I ever cared about, all the money, all the status, all of it. And he's like, gone. And that's what brought me to my knees and brought me home. And it's in that moment that I realized, I was like, you've been with me the entire time. I just wasn't looking. I thought it was out, not in. And it's where the tenderness comes from. Like there's a part of me that like I stopped doing martial arts and I stopped doing a lot of things for a while. And I avoided most of my previous life because I was like, I just want to love everybody. And then, like there were all these seasons that I went through and I talked to a lot of people about this because they're like, you're like a walking pattern interrupt. You can hold this like masculine frame and be boom, boom, boom. And like the moment we're in it, you break down in your knees and you cry in front of us. And I was like, I love my feelings. Like I love being expressive and sharing the gift of it, but it feels like freedom because I'm home and like, it's all of me all of the time. And it's been beautiful to like watch my journey and also like really, really humbling. Like there was a passage and I'm going to summarize it, but it was from Isaiah. And it was like, as I continue to walk through an inhospitable, hostile wilderness, constantly walking away from what was while walking towards what will be, you will give me living, refreshing streams of water. And I was like, the part that I missed is it was walking, not waiting.
Yeah.
It was walking and it was away from what was. And like, that passage led me for a good year. And so, it's really, really interesting because, like I talk about mindset a lot because I've lived a lot of it. Like I've had to come up in a life that like, I was like, okay, like, yeah, cool. And like, I've had to tell myself, I'm like, God's prepping me for something. Like there's something coming. Like I can't see. But like one of my favorite quotes for myself now, and I write this on my notebook almost every day. And I was like, I need to remember that when I ask God to move mountains, I wake up with a shovel. Right?
That's
Like
good, man.
there's this part of like, right? It's not, and even in the old new age world, like everyone's like a manifestation. I'm like, that doesn't mean sitting there with your thumb up your butt. It means setting your intention and getting to work, right? Like you read it in the Bible, the ones that plant the gardens are not the one that gets the harvest. It's the ones that tend to the gardens and, toil the soil that get the harvest. And there's all these like moments over and over and over again. And, I'm blessed and so grateful to be here. And that softness now, that softness was brought by my son. My son's almost 8. And being an entrepreneur and being a coach and being a public speaker and a keynoter, like I missed like the first 3 years of his life just
Yeah.
on the road and on airplanes and in all these different parts and places. And I had on paper what everybody said I wanted, except I had no soul. Like I had a hole inside of me. And I feel like that boy was a gift from God, because like I will share my testimony at some point in my podcast, but I have to map it out because it's so long. But to the point of like it almost being comical, of like a year ago when things were the darkest I'd ever been in comparison to most of my life, I was flying home from Bali. I had just run a women's retreat where for 6 days I had 20 women, and I ran a retreat to help them love themselves in the deepest alignment. And I talked about God, and I had not come home. And it was the number one part of my conversation. I was like, God, 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 God. These women touched me. It was amazing. I get on a flight on the way home. 1 a.m. I see this 86-year-old man named Hugh struggling with his luggage, and nobody would help him. And I was like, sir, can I help you with your luggage? He's like, yeah, of course. I put it up. He ends up sitting in the seat next to me. He's been a traveling pastor for 64 years. We end up having a 5-hour conversation about God. And then he gives me his business card. And it was a paper card. He's not a computer guy. And I put it in my backpack, and I'll own this. I put it in my backpack with no intention of following
Right.
up. And then my backpack had water spilled on it. And I opened it, and the card was ruined. And I couldn't see his contact info. I'm like, I'm never going to hear from this guy. The next day, he was on my calendar, booked through my website for a 15-minute call.
Oh my
Turned into a
God.
3-hour call. And he's like, I loved our conversation, but I think you worship the wrong God. And you open to talking about it. I was on my knees, bawling. And I was like, yes, you're right. Yes, you're right. Yes, you're right. And then I remember this one question I asked him. I said, what Bible do I start with? And he's like, that's not for me to answer. That's between you and God. And I'll never forget this. I got in my car, and it was an hour drive home. And my son is 6 at the time. We live in Montana, but me and my son are, the ones in faith, but never a conversation. I get home from work that day, and he said, Dad, I went to the store earlier and I got a new toy, but there was someone handing these out at the exit, and I got one for you. And it was a pocket New Testament.
Come on,
And
man.
I lost it. I lost it. And there were hundreds of these moments in like a matter of days. And it was so serendipitous, but that's where that softness comes from for me, is like, in order to appreciate love, I feel like you have to have lived in the dark.
Yeah.
And I spent 33 years of my life convinced that I was a robot and I would never feel again. And I'll never forget this one therapist, because she shifted everything for me. I was like, you don't get it. I'm just numb. Like I'm dead on the inside. And she looked me dead in the eye, and she's like, George, numb is a feeling. And it like broke me.
Wow. Wow.
It like broke my perspective. And then I realized what a gift feeling is.
Yeah.
But Carl Jung, because of all my new age roots of studying Carl Jung and psychology and Advaita Vedanta and all these different things, has a quote that I love. And he says, the tips of your branches can only touch up to heaven. To the depth of your roots have seen hell. And it's that perspective for me, to where I love and feel so deeply in the best of moments, because I've felt and lost so deeply in the darkest, knowing that they were all given to me by God for my perspective and for some reason that I can't see, to be able to serve or stand for people. And like, that's me being a lighthouse.
Man, what a story, man. Man, this is not what I was thinking this was gonna look like. It's better than I could have imagined. And thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that. I love that you said that you love your feelings, because to me, the old early church father quote is, "The glory of God is man fully alive." And I think that we think fully alive is just has a certain like religious thing to it, but it is actually, I asked the Lord this one time about revival. I don't know if you've ever really like wrestled with the word revival. Like, I don't think it's the ultimate destination, but I think it's necessary for people to be revived. And I asked the Lord one time after talking to a man who had experienced great things, like supernatural things in his life, and seen a lot of people healed and delivered and set free. I'd spent like 3 hours talking with him. He had helped lead one of the greatest revivals in modern day history, the Brownsville revival in Pensacola, Florida, in the 90s. And I sat there for like 2 and 3 hours listening to this man tell story after story after story. And I remember later that evening, just me talking in prayer and like, what is revival? What is revival? And I felt the whisper of Holy Spirit say, it's when you feel what I feel about everything.
Mm.
And it is truly being fully alive, feeling life in all of it. Um, that numb is a feeling. I love that. That is so strong, man. Um, so man, thank you for sharing that part of your story. And I pray I'm almost at the place where I'm like, promise me you'll do this podcast.
I will.
And
It's been on my heart.
and share your whole journey because man, you don't know how many people are in your shoes that have looked for every way possible to find dad, to find
Mhm.
Abba, and they don't know. So they're doing what every orphan does is go somewhere where I can find home, find somebody to love me, find something. And that's why you see so many people connecting with illegitimate sources of that is because they're just orphaned, man. They got to know they don't know yet. They don't know who they are. They don't know who he is. But people like you are helping them find their way home. So man, please do that podcast. Please share. That would
Oh,
be amazing.
it's on my heart. It's been coming up a lot, which this is how God guides me. I get this thought and this idea, and then I like ran it by my CEO, and she's like, "Yeah, whenever you're ready." And then like I'll start to publicly sprinkle it in, and this is getting recorded and going to the world. And then, so it's also how I use Parkinson's law and create the container for myself. And I'm like, yeah, I shared parts of that today that like I've been excited to share but haven't articulated yet. I'm like, I can see these pieces coming together here. And then I'll be sitting here in a couple days and I'll have a block in my calendar. I'm like, I gotta do a podcast today? And I'll be like, oh, I have this outline. I'm like, that one just doesn't feel good today. So let's just go for this one. And
Yeah.
that's kind of how it goes.
Yeah, well, it sounds to me like God doesn't give you he doesn't allow you to miss it. He
No,
makes
oh
it pretty
no.
obvious for you. I
No,
always
no,
tell
like
people like, man, as I grow in this journey, I've been walking with the Lord. I grew up in a pastor's home, but that means nothing. I didn't
mhm,
really know Jesus until I was an adult. But I've been in this thing for almost 2 decades, and the further I get down the road, the more I realize, like, the will of God's not fragile, and He will make it so blaringly obvious of what the next step is. There's just a trust and a care that grows between you and the Lord as you walk this journey a lot further, and He will not let you miss it. He just won't.
mm-mm,
He's
mm-mm,
too good to do that.
yeah, it's he definitely makes sure I don't miss, and I joke with people. I'm like, "You guys remember I was a Marine, right? Like, we ate crayons. There was only 3 colors for me. It was like black, white, pink, right?" And I'm like, and just so everybody knows, my website is pink. Pink is genuinely my favorite color, so I add a crayon in there. But it's really, really interesting because like I've learned, like I even talk to people all the time when I talk to them about their intuition or their feelings or these thoughts that they have, and I'm like, okay, cool. So you mean to tell me that when you were driving today down the highway in silence, that you just got this thought of Mark? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, did you plan that last night? And they're like, no. And I'm like, did you set your intention this morning that when you were going to be driving down the highway at 2:30 in the afternoon, you're going to pass this deer, see this happen, and then you're going to like think about Mark? And they're like, no. I'm like, where do you think that came from? And they're like, oh. And I was like, listen, here's what I've learned. That's God calling, and you only lose when you don't pick up the phone. And I was like, because those are the moments that he calls. And I was like,
Yeah.
it's taken me years, and I've learned this because I've also always like been led by this inner guidance, and it took me a long time to realize it was God the whole time, like this
Yeah.
gut feeling, this thought, right? This overwhelming thought. And I think too, like one of the books that did it for me, because of the life that I lived, is I learn a lot faster through the opposing view than I do through the view that I want, right? And somebody gifted me the Screw Tape Letters by C.S. Lewis.
Oh, wow.
And I was through that book in like an hour and a half the first day, and I was through that book about 10 times in the first like 2 weeks. And I was like, oh, and then I looked at them and I was like, this is why they said the devil's in the details, because the details are in your head, and your head stops you from taking action in your heart. God is in our heart. Your brain is not a part of the God equation. Your brain is not the part that matters. It's your heart, and allowing that heart to drive your decisions. And like, those are the things, like wrestling with my humanity and like navigating a divorce and a conscious uncoupling and being accused of things I'd never done in my life. Like, I was told I'd get arrested. I was told like I wouldn't see my kids again. And everyone's like, leave, leave. And I was like, I can't. I'm like, why? I'm like, God told me to go home. And like, ended up turning that and standing in it, but having to choose love. And like, I know it sounds cliche, and I'm a baby in my commitment to God, but I've been around it my whole life and dancing with it. And it truly, truly is a testament to like, when I ask God for love, he does not give me love. He gives me opportunities to love where I didn't think I could love before.
Yeah.
And when I ask God for patience, he's like, great. How long you got? You willing to wait 40 years? Because we did in the Bible, right? And it's like,
Yeah.
but all of it is an invitation, to my point earlier, to keep walking in faith, but walking at that steepest level of feeling. And to the point of feeling, I'll give you another one that broke me, because this is all mindset for me too, right? Like
Yeah, for sure.
one of my favorite quotes that everybody repeats, and I said this about 2 years ago, is I was like, what we don't realize is that perspective is the only difference between our prison and our power, because the situation in front of us does not change. The only thing that changes is how we choose to see it.
Yeah.
And like, perspective only comes through experience. Experience only comes through action. And the reason people struggle with mindset is because they get addicted to stagnation and stuck in their head, because that's the devil's game, right? There's another good book I read called The Bait of Satan, where the
Yeah.
number one tool he uses is offense. Because what does offense
Offense.
do? It brake checks you, right? And it's like, well, if he died for us and you're perfect, made whole and complete in his eyes, I don't care what you think or feel. I don't care if you have imposter syndrome. He didn't give it to you. The devil
Right.
did. Take
Right.
that action, right? So my son has been probably the biggest communication vessel for me for God. And I have a lot of entrepreneurs in my life. I coach entrepreneurs, 5 figures, 6 figures, 7 figures. It doesn't matter. I'm like, no, I'm going to help you love yourself at the deepest level, scale your business, marketing, mindset. And a whole lot of them this last year have thanked me for bringing them home to God. And it was through loving them. And I had one at my house. I had this woman entrepreneur at my house, and she was sitting there and she was talking about like how she just wants it to be easy and predictable. Like, I just want like to know what's going to happen, and like it almost to be like stagnant or stale. Like, I'd rather just check boxes. And my son was 6 at the time, 6. And he walked over and he's like, Dad, can I have a piece of paper? I'm like, yeah, bro, of course. And he's like, okay, cool. So he looks at both of us and he draws a flat line on the paper. And he's like, all right. And I won't say her name, but he's like, hey, so-and-so, if this was your heartbeat, what would it mean? And she's like, well, it would mean I'm dead. Like, I'm no longer alive. And he's like, correct. Then he draws a heartbeat. And he's like, if this was your heartbeat, what would it mean? And she's like, well, it would mean that I'm alive. And he's like, that's what you're supposed to feel. That's how your feelings are supposed to be. That's what it means to be alive. I cried for a day and a half.
I bet. I bet.
And I felt like God just channeled through my son. But it's this opportunity. And for me, it's the invitation to give it to God. It's the invitation to feel the feeling, to get back into action, because I genuinely believe that inaction is one of the greatest tools of the devil. We read over and
100%.
over and over. It's the ones who chop wood and carry water. It's the one who uses their hands. It's the one who answers the call. And, we live in a world that celebrates stagnation, right? Doom scrolls,
True.
distraction, boom, boom. And just like that same shaman, right? I'd never been quiet enough to hear God's whispers. I was avoiding the one relationship I was guaranteed to spend the rest of my life with, which was myself. And the moment I looked at that relationship, it opened up my conduit to God, because there was no distraction, which meant there was only one direction for me to go. And quite frankly, it was on my knees and looking up.
It's
And
amazing.
I feel so humbled by it. Like I feel like a little baby, and I feel lost most of the times. And it's invitations for me to look up and like with my mindset or my doubts or my fears or my frustrations. And I was like, well, the only thing that changes though, is there any action that I take? And so what's the action that would give me a different result? Because I'm not going to magically feel different. I'm going to act differently and do it in the glory of God and keep moving forward. And that's kind of how I operate in my day.
That's amazing. My spiritual father always would tell us, tears are a gift.
Yes.
Tears are a gift, and tears many times are a compass. And he would always say, "So therefore, steward your tenderness." We always
Mm,
talk about the 18-inch journey, from the head to the heart. Take me on a journey. I'm letting go, getting lost in you. That's a song, the lyrics of a song. But that journey, and we always talk about the tears are what sows the keeps the soil tender of the heart. And
mm.
man, I'm so thankful that you have, it seems to me, really stewarded your tenderness. And I think that's so important, man. The, you said something and we just went right past it, but I want to make sure people hear it, that you found entrepreneurial success before you found yourself.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And not like kind of success, like major success, like
Massive success.
massive success, and then you found yourself later. So that tells me that money doesn't fix it.
Oh no,
Money's not gonna money is not gonna fix, like, I know so many people watching this podcast are like, if you would just teach me how to make money, Mark, like, then it's going to fix everything." And it's like, that's why these conversations, George, are so important, because it lets people know, "No, look, I've helped scale nine-figure companies, and yet I was still lost, confused, self-harm, doing everything that I could to find wholeness."
yeah, because
So
what happens is when you do that, it all gets removed because the consequences increase until you answer the call of you. And it's
yeah,
the number one thing I coach people on now, because even if you go in the lens of personal development, it's not do, be, have, it's be, do, have. If you go in the lens of future self journaling, it's not talking about the current, it's operating as you would be in the future to align your reticular activating systems to see situations differently. And even the joke of, or the point of, that perspective is the difference between your prison and power, right? If I take two entrepreneurs and one of them runs a company that does $250,000 a month and one of them runs a company that does $10,000 a month, that $10,000 a month entrepreneur will tell me every single thing that's wrong with their business, where they're stuck. If I hand it to the $250,000 a month entrepreneur, they're going to be like, oh, that's all opportunity. I'll fix it in the next day. But the information is the same. It's how we
yeah,
see it. And that
yeah.
more trap is, it's called toxic thinking. There's actually a good book a friend of mine wrote. I had him on the podcast, called Jamie Smart, and it's called The Little Book of Clarity. It's no different than I'll start going to the gym Monday, or I'll start on New Year's, or
Yeah,
I'll do it next Friday. And it's like,
yeah, yeah.
well, number one, that doesn't exist yet,
It doesn't
right?
exist.
Like depression comes from thinking about the past, and anxiety comes from thinking about the future, and both rob you from the present. Because in the present is when you plant your seed, and we live in the results of the actions we took 90 days ago, right?
That's
And
good.
so understanding that is that it is that more trap, right? If I just had more money, the truth is, and this is what I had to learn, I made the money. I had more of it all. And the reason I pissed it all away and lost it all is because when I had it and I had space, I couldn't stand being in the same space of myself. So I paid for more distractions. I
Oh
paid
my
for more
gosh.
challenges. I bought more things because I didn't know how to sit with myself. And so that's the way I learned the lesson. And then I went from multiple houses, multiple cars, and now I'll own this. I live in Montana. I drive a Subaru Outback Wilderness, and I will buy another one and another one and another one. And I love it. And I have my guns, my car, my son, and my clothes. And I have not bought a worldly possession in probably 2 years. And I have never been happier in my life.
Come on,
Oh,
man.
and how funny. that moment happened and all the challenges that I was facing in business went away and the right people started showing up. And so you have to operate as if it's already happened, which the only way you can is if you're in the deepest levels of alignment. And any rest of it is false prophets, right? There is no happiness on the other side of money. And I say this all the time. You're not going to die with your bank account's balance on your headstone. And I think one of the gifts of my life is I've seen enough people die in front of me to realize that at no point in any of those moments was I like, God, I wish I had another 10 grand in the account. I'm like, no, I wish I had another minute. I
Yeah.
wish I had another moment. I wish I had the ability to connect with them one more time or hug my dad one more time or bring that friend back one more time.
Yeah.
And it's all just distraction from what really matters, which is our hearts. And if you live in your heart, no, it's not a hockey stick game. It's not a get rich quick game. It's a long game of fulfillment, joy, and massive impact that we can't predict, because if you can predict it, somebody's done it already. It's supposed to feel uncertain because it's your vision. It's supposed to feel uncertain because you're making it as you go. And everybody wants to know the path ahead of them. Well, if you walk that path, that's going to lead you right back to where you are because someone's already made it. Your
Yeah.
job is to have the confidence and the faith to step in the dark, because that's when you carve your path. But you don't
Yeah.
pay your way into the dark. You love your way into the dark by loving yourself. And it, at the deepest level, is the most important place to be.
Yeah, man. Yeah, God doesn't give out maps, he just gives you a compass, you know? And, it's about the journey. It's not even about the destination.
Nope.
I've been telling people about this, like, they've been asking me, "Okay, Mark, so you're on this new entrepreneurial journey. You completely left the world that you knew, the church world back in 2015, and then, you know, you've had these past 4 years to pastor a small church, and that small church, you know, was, if I'm being honest, a little bit better version of the world that I came out of. And now these past 14 months, it's been like, no, just completely leave it all behind. This is the story of Abraham, right? You know, Abraham, walk away from everything that you know, your land, your family, your father's household, all of these things. And this is what's interesting, George. I don't know if you ever read this or heard this, but in the story of Abraham, and it says, "And go to a land that I will show you." If you look up the Hebrew word for "go to a land that I will show you," it actually translates, "And go find the real you." So what God is really saying to Abraham is not like, "I'm gonna show you a land." A land is only the direct result of the man who has chosen to live in it. So the
Mm,
journey is always about the person that you're becoming, right?
yep.
And so, like, I've been telling people the past 14 months, this entrepreneurial journey, I don't even like, maybe this is wrong. I don't have a lot of goals. Like, I have things that I need. Like, I wanna take care of my family. I want to be able to bless them. I want to be able to take care of them. Also have things in my heart that I feel called to do so that I can serve other people in other ways.
Mhm.
But, like, really, I don't have these, like, goals. I said, because what the beautiful thing about this journey is not the where I've arrived, but who I'm becoming in the process. And, like, I'm finding I'm becoming the real me. And I wanna say this to you as a huge compliment, George. Like, and I'm saying this to qualify it, like, this is the biggest compliment I could give you. Um, I I have dedicated my life to the love of God and to make sure that people hear the goodness of the gospel and what we call beloved identity. I've given my life to make sure that the gospel is declared and it's actually good news. Because I grew up in a church where the good news was actually bad news.
Mm,
But you know, we're coming out of that. But the word righteousness in the New Testament is not just right standing with God. Like, "Oh, great, George, 6 months ago, you made a decision to follow Christ." Well, first of all, you didn't have a choice. He chose you. Like,
mhm.
you made a commitment, but dude, you can't outrun him. He found you. You didn't find him, he found you. Like, so, like, I am convinced, man, you belong to him, and Jesus said, "Those who you put in my hand, no man can pluck them out," you know? But I wanna say this to you, the word righteousness doesn't mean right standing with God. Is it that? Yeah, it is, But righteousness, the Greek word is you as you ought to be. And when you're talking, George, I mean this with all of my guts. You are as you ought to be. Probably one of the most authentic people I think I've talked to in a very long time. And man, what an honor. I thought we were going to talk about business, but what a gift you've given to people that money's not going to fix this, entrepreneurship's not going to fix this, but you have, without you realizing it, you've preached the gospel today. It's like the book of Esther never mentions God, but God's in every verse. And man, that's your life, George. And I just want to say to you, man, you are a shining example of righteousness in the earth. I just want you to know that, man. I'm like moved. I'm shocked. I'm surprised. Like, I don't mean that in a bad way. I'm just like, dude, I did not expect to get hit with this radical feeling of authenticity. And man, I just want to honor you today and just say, man, you are exemplifying righteousness in this conversation. That's a big,
Brother, received at a very deep level.
yeah, man.
Received. And
Yeah.
the funny part is that this whole conversation is about the foundations required for business to work.
Yeah, yeah, right. Right.
And truthfully, my authenticity is something that I've worked my whole life. And you're right. I suck at hide and seek with God because he found me and he was like, my joke was before I came home to God when I used to use the word universe, which I still do now because it's his and he made it, but it's
Yeah,
God
right.
with a capital G, and O
Yeah.
and D are capital for me too. Like not
Yeah.
just the first G, like the whole thing. I'm
Yeah. Yeah.
pretty devout about caps now. I used to say this and it was what I used to tell myself. And I said, the universe will keep increasing the consequences until you learn the lesson. And really, the way that I look at it now is God just kept yelling my name louder and louder and louder, but I didn't recognize the wrapping paper. And I realized that the best things don't come in pretty little packages, but underneath them all is that same feeling. And I started to recognize these parts and going through it and like reading the Bible and like going through parts of it. And like, even I had a down moment a couple of months ago and I was on a road trip and I went to YouTube and put on the animated movie of the story of Job. And I watched it like 22 times. Like I was like, repeat, repeat,
Yeah.
repeat, repeat. Right. And, I take into account so many things that I've heard and consumed, because even when I was on the path before I committed my life to Christ, I would consume things from pastors. Like I've been watching pastors for years, spoken word poetry around God and creation and like all of these different things. And where I really started to find God was in all the situations that I was afraid to look at. And I was like, I won't look till I have more. I won't look until I can take a step back. And he's like, And he's like, George, you know why I created bison and they're the only animal that walks into the storm? Because I'm showing you the example. Open the box. And like, I think that that's the mindset. And it's a gift because, to your point, there is no destination. Like the next moment is not promised. Like God knows, but I might leave here and not make it to pick up my son today.
Yeah.
But I would hate to get there to meet him and be like, I had this entire treasure chest of gifts for you to use for the world, but you never opened the first box. And I read a
Wow.
quote. I read a quote the other day that shook me to the core on procrastination. So I had to save it. I have a different definition of procrastination yesterday that made me sit up. Procrastination is the arrogant assumption that God owes you another opportunity to do what you had time to do.
Oh, man. Wow.
And it rocked me. And I think about those moments and I think about those perspectives. But the only thing that's allowed me to take those actions is being myself and allowing myself to be enough. And that doesn't mean I have it figured out. That doesn't mean I have the answers. It means that even in men's work, as I've been in men's work and coached men's works and consciousness works, like I love the definition of masculine we use. The masculine's job is to say yes mess up, say I'm sorry, and then say yes again.
Yeah, that's
Right?
good.
Like you think about it as a husband or a partner, right? Like there is no rigid frame that gets held forever, right?
Yeah.
The way that I love integrity and how I define integrity is the only actual things I'm in integrity with are the things I'm focusing on in this moment. Right? The
Mm,
only person I'm in integrity with right now is you. If you were to
yeah.
call my 7-year-old son and be like, "What do you want your dad doing?" He'd be like, "Being at the skate park with me, tickling me." And technically, I'm out of integrity with him. If you asked my CEO, she'd want me working on the business or prepping for the event in a week and a half, right? If you call my partner, she's going to be like, "I want him with me here." So the
Yeah.
only place I'm in integrity is with you. And I realized that my life has boiled down to thousands of moments every day to where even when there's things that are out of integrity, the only thing it requires is my intention and attention to bring it back into integrity. And I've realized that those are the pebbles that God leaves. Those are the
Wow.
ones that he puts in. And as long as I follow those and celebrate the victory, and when I feel stuck or overwhelmed, I don't look down, I look up. I don't put my head down in shame and tiredness. And if I do, I end up dropping to my knees and looking up and being like, "Hey, God." And he's like, "I gave this to you for a reason. I didn't give you anything that you can't handle, right? Like, I'm with you every step of the way. The more the load that I put on you, the more presence I have on your back." And I think that that's the game because it's everything is growth, and being a human being is growth, and it's an evolution. And it's to your point, I hike. I live in Montana. I live at the entrance of Glacier National Park. And it took me years of hiking to get to the fact that now, more often than not, I never make it to the summit because it was never about the summit. But every one of those hikes, there's a cry, there's a piece of clarity, there's a connection with God. And I'll go out and I'll make it halfway up the trail. And then I'll have this overwhelming cry. And I'm like, that's why I was out here today. And I will turn around and go back to the car. I'm like, I'll take a picture next time. Right. Because the other trap that happened, to your point earlier, to tie some of this together is, oh, if I just make more money, if I just have more clients, all that does is put more water in a bleeding bucket, and it exacerbates the pain that is felt because the other side of that is actually thinking there's a finish line. But I
Yeah.
will tell you right now, the only finish line that exists is when God brings you home. Because other than that, we're just disrespecting the gift that he gave us to be full of purpose and meaning and live in his honor. That's entrepreneurship for me. That's
It's
service to
good.
me.
It's
Yeah, we
good.
might be selling a product, we might be coaching people, but to your point earlier, I don't have a vision or goals. My goal is impact. My goal
Yeah.
is connecting. My goal is like, how can I serve you today? Like I pick a word a year, and this last year, it's probably my words that will stick forever. And my CEO looked at me and we finished an event, and I had a woman come up to me after the event. And she's like, "I felt like God was standing at your back, using your mouth as a megaphone for 3 days for entrepreneurs." And I looked at Ashley and I was like, my only two words for the rest of my life are humbled servant. That's all I want to be. Like
Mm,
I can't stand most of our industry. You
yeah.
can't sit at this table because you don't make this. You can't do this because you don't make this. I'm like, I will. Let's go. Let's go.
Yeah.
I'm like, call me, text me, message me. Like, God is community. God is love, like rising
Yes.
tides, abundance, like all of it. Like, we get to live and work in that honor. But even in the world of business, when we sell products, when we sell services, they're not the end goal. They're the bridge to get that person on the path to their end goal and to empower them to be the hero of their own journey.
Yeah.
That's the part that people miss in business. And so it's like just this incredible game of like, I used to hide in my coaching. I'm like, oh, Solomon's paradox. I wonder why it's named after the Bible, right? Like, I
Yeah.
will teach you the things I do not do for myself. I'm like, oh, you want the non religious version? The cobbler's kids never have shoes, right? Like, we've been surrounded by them.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
funny part that you'll appreciate is that for everybody who accused me of being new age, right? And I mean everybody, I have read and studied every vein that you can imagine, from Buddhism to Autovedontism, breathwork, consciousness, plant medicine, personal development. I was a coach, everything. Every single piece of advice that I've ever picked up from any of them, I have now equilaterally found in my Bible. And I was like, oh, found
For
the
sure.
source, right? Like
For sure.
every one of them brought me home. And it's the
Yep.
reason I have such deep faith now, though, is because I see the stepping stones and the magic of him playing hide and seek with me. He's like, I'll find you. I'll find you. I'll find you. And then being here now, it really, really is a testament. And I love what you're up to and what you're, committing to. And I think for me, I've walked it so many times that God has just started to make me comfortable with the fact that the moment I think I'm done, I might as well just start tearing it down because he's about to rebuild it.
Yeah.
And it's now starting to excite me instead of scare me. And I'm like, oh, that's why you did it 17 times to me. Right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, you're going to call again. There's a season coming. I don't know. There's a client that is going to show up that has been in a situation that no one's ever been in but me, and I'll be able to help them. Right? It's this just like beautiful perspective that I genuinely, besides reading Ephesians a lot and putting on my armor of God and making sure it's God and not evil, is just genuinely me understanding that if you and I went on a run and we're like, hey, we're going to run 2 miles and we get to 1.5 miles and we're tired, our thought is never, oh, it hurts, let's stop. Our thought is, oh, it hurts, which means we're getting stronger and faster. Let's keep going. But yet when it comes to life, we wonder why we atrophy our resilience and our ability to keep going, because the moment it gets hard, we're like, oh, no, but that's God's gym. Life is God's gym,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's where you get stronger. And so having gratitude for the game is what creates the opportunity to love that path, right? And we can't get upset that when we go to the gym, we're like, oh, I've been in the gym in a year. I went today. I'm so bummed I didn't get a 6-pack in one day.
Yeah.
Right? It's
Yeah.
consistency and daily practice and daily habits. And like, even for me as a man of faith, these are the things that I struggle with, because I even had this, and I'll share this with everybody. Things got dark a couple weeks ago, like really, really dark on the inside. And I found myself in shame because I'm like, why is God punishing me? And I'm like, and logically, I'm like, and I'm talking out loud. I'm like, I know God doesn't punish me. God loves me and has me.
Mhm.
And it was this, I'm doing it wrong. I'm not being a good enough man of faith. Like, our relationship isn't where it needs to be. I'm not praying enough. And I find sneaky traps over and over. And there is no finish line or no perfection, just like entrepreneurship, just like mindset, just like relationships, right? Like, I say this to people all the time. I'm like, oh, you're married? They're like, yeah. I'm like, do you date your wife the same way you did the first week you met? And they're like, yeah, no. I'm like, yeah. And if it didn't evolve, your relationship wouldn't be ideal.
Exactly.
Our mindset, our business practices, the way that we run business, the way that we have a relationship with God, they're always evolving because they're invitations for strength. That's how you make a muscle stronger.
That's
And
right.
I've learned now the reason that it was so hard for so long is because I resisted the journey. I fought the journey. I fought the path, and I was complaining about the workout, but yet I asked for the result on the other side. And so now to have that result, you have to love the process, or else it actually prevents the result from coming. So to your point earlier, the reason everybody falls into the trap of like, well, if you just gave me more money, if you just gave me more money, money comes after an equal sign. There's intention and action before that happens. But when all you want is more money, the thing that you're not taking is a new action that would allow it to create itself.
It's
And
good.
that's the trap over and over. Like, and even if, like, I'm sure you've shot a pistol, right? Or a rifle.
Oh, yeah.
This is how I teach it to dudes. Ready? If you're using iron sights on a pistol and you have your rear sight post and your front sight post and the target, what are you focusing on to make sure that you hit the target? The
Mhm.
front sight post. If you look at the target and the target is clear, you miss the target,
Right.
because to hit the target, your rear sight post has to be covered and aligned on your front one, and your front one has to be in focus. Hitting the target is blurry, and it's just a byproduct to you of focusing on your intention and the actions you take. And if you do this and they're in alignment, you'll hit the target. It's no different than money, no different than business, no different than life, but it requires that we take action. And in
It's
that action is where I've discovered myself. It hasn't been, oh, I feel better. I'm like, oh, I feel how I feel. Let me give it to God and let me take this action anyways. And then I look back and I'm like, oh, that's why. Oh, that makes sense now.
Yeah.
Right. And I
Yeah.
just think it's this invitation over and over. So that's how I see it, or at least how I internalize it every day.
That's beautiful, man. Well, listen, we've been on the podcast for a little over an hour and it's been amazing. I want to ask you just give you one question at least
Yeah.
for somebody that's here, like, because I feel like you've given such an amazing foundation for like you have to have this in place in order for you to actually have a legitimate successful business. Um, so that begins with yourself.
Yep.
So I noticed this phrase that I've seen in your website, the podcast, everything that you do, which is relationships beat algorithms. And what does that mean to you, and why is it the core of your philosophy? I think
Yeah.
it feels kind of dumb to ask that now, but I'm, knowing all
Well,
that
I
you've
think you know
said.
why. I
Yeah,
think the why has answered itself, but
yeah,
I'll summarize.
yeah.
But I'll even give a tactical answer. And by the way, if you ever want to do round 2 or 3 and hit strategies and tactics, I will give you everything I have.
I'm like, man, can we do a series together?
Yeah,
This has been
let's do a
so
series, bro.
rich, man.
I'm
It's
in.
been
Let's do a
rich.
series, bro. I will do this with you anytime, all the time. Like,
Okay,
consider
okay,
me in.
okay, okay,
Um, I'm going to answer this logically and tactically first. Okay.
okay.
Human beings buy from and transact with other human beings, but only after they feel safe.
Mm,
You've never been in a store about to buy a product and then somebody made you feel unsafe and then you continue to buy that product. And everybody listening to this has been in a moment where they're so excited to get something and then something happens in the experience that changes how you feel unconsciously, safety wise, and then you remove yourself from that equation. The world that we live in now, especially in business, has been relegated to transactions, right? It's smoke and mirrors. I care about you, but I'm going to transact with you. But we forget that prior to the internet, people were building $100 million businesses based on small town ethics and values.
yes,
When I say relationships beat algorithms, it's that no matter what, the success of your company, the success of your journey, the success of your customers boils down to the success of the relationship you have with them.
it's good.
And if you could tell me that it would be a good idea to marry your wife and then relegate her to one automated text message every Friday and think you're still going to be married, well, you're welcome. It's not going to work. The
Yeah,
same is true in business. We don't have entitlement. We don't have an understanding that just because somebody buys our product, our job is done. The mistake that people make is they think when people buy, the relationship is ended. That's the day the relationship begins,
begins. That's right.
because your job is not to sell a product and service. Your job is to deliver on the result or get them one step closer. That's what leadership is. And I
Yes.
have companies galore come to me and I'm like, what's your biggest fear? And they're like, oh, I can't get any more clients. I'm like, you're going to go out of business. And they're like, why? And I'm like, because you have the wrong fear. I'm like, what's the right fear? I'm like, that you have clients who paid you and haven't gotten results. You're just waiting to bleed out the back. And you want to put more people into a broken system. So when I say relationships beat algorithms, is that without relationships, you don't have anything. Scaling businesses doesn't come from acquisition. It comes from retention. Retention comes from relationships and results.
Yeah,
And so
that's right.
focusing on the right things. And the reason I say that tangibly is especially a lot of like starting entrepreneurs think it's the funnel, think it's the website, think it's the offer. Most of the time, it's the complexity that's getting in the way of you connecting to a relationship that would let somebody come in. Like,
Yeah.
even for me, we have a rule, even with my event, we have an event in 10 days, not by the time this comes up, we do them, quite frequently. I told my team, I'm like, we can't even build a landing page for this event until we've done 5 of them in a Google Doc. Because if I can't sell it out in a Google Doc, why am I going to spend time, resources, and money to build a site that I don't know that works? Because truthfully, that's just me putting lipstick on a pig to convince you
Yeah.
to come to something you might not want to come to,
Yeah,
right?
right.
But we tend to create this complexity over and over because of the world that we live in and everybody's instant gratification and desire to be disconnected. that gets in the way of the number one thing that moves the needle in business, which is human to human. And so relationships always have to come first, or you have no chance of winning. Your team, your customers, your clients, but everyone's like, okay. And like I joke, I'm the king of non-virality. I've been making content for 15 years. I've had one video go viral my whole life. One. Everything else has been consistency. And they're like, your podcast. I'm like, do you want to know what's funny? Is like, I still grow my podcast one by one. There's like 82 Delta flight attendants that listen to my podcast. There's about 6 coffee shops in this valley that listen to my podcast. And they're like, how? I'm like, well, ask them how their day is. And then they tell me, and then I ask them questions and they're like, hey, do you have any advice on this? I'm like, actually, I do. Oh, and I recorded an episode on it. If you ever want to listen to it, here, I'll send you the link. Like, it's relationships. People relate to people. And then when they feel safe, they consume the content or walk the path. Just like if you were going to go to a gym and there were 2 personal trainers to hire, and one of them ignored you when you walked in the door, and one of them was like, hey, Mark, good morning. How's your day? I love your hoodie. How was your vacation? Which one are you going to hire? Right? And the truth about 2024 is that winning on depth and being a connected human being is the best strategy and tactic that exists, because everybody else is in the chase.
So good.
Everybody's getting transacted with. And so that's what I mean by that phrase, is that at the end of the day, and I've lost enough companies. When I lost all my companies during COVID, the only thing that left was all the customers of all those companies that were just waiting for me to launch something new. That's the true secret, is relationships. It's your army, it's your tribe, it's your culture. It's the people who stand for you, that allow you to grow and evolve as they grow and evolve, that will be on that journey with you the entire time, but only if it's deeper than a transaction. So that's what I mean.
Well, I've already got you to commit to a series here. So
I'm in.
Man, listen, what an honor to have you on the podcast today. And I know you got to pick up your son soon. And I want to honor your time. Man, first of all, you host the Mind of George podcast. So I recommend everybody that's watching this, go subscribe, download. I'm sure it's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all the things. And plus, I'll put a link for it in the show notes as well. But George, I want to tell you, man, what a gift to hear your story. What a gift to hear your heart and hear your journey. And like, man, my heart resonates so strong with like where you're at, what you're talking about, because I am in the early stages of this, like 14 months in. I've been, if I'm being honest, I've been a broke pastor living paycheck to paycheck most of my life. Came from a really like pretty poor family. At times where cereal was the meal for all 3 meals a day, as a kid. I come from all of that, but something shifted in me 14 months ago, and it says, and kind of the whisper that I heard in my heart was, aren't you tired of living off of other people's generosity when I've given you the power to create wealth? And man, it really just hit me really strong. But I will be honest with you, the biggest turnoff that I have with the entrepreneur world is everybody's flexing possessions. They're flexing things, and honestly, that does not move the needle for me.
Nope.
Like when I see these guys like flashing watches and cars and things, I'm like, that doesn't move the needle. However, I would tell you what moves the needle for me: watching people win because I've been able to help them. Watching somebody find time freedom, watching people find financial freedom to finally leave their 9 to 5 behind and like be able to be a family man again. Those are the flexes for me. Like, not like, okay, great, you got a side by side, but is your son in it with you? Like, do you have a boat, but does your family actually want to spend time with you on it?
Don't tell me you left the church. You're taking everybody to church right now. Like, go. Yes. Like, yes.
Yeah. So like, that is the biggest turnoff for me, is it's always numbers, algorithms, stats. It dehumanizes the business. And like, man, even in Jewish culture, which is the foundations of Christian faith, I should say the foundation of where all this comes from. They believe in value exchange, which is why they're some of the wealthiest people on the planet, is
Yep.
because they believe in value exchange, and it's all about relationship.
Yep.
And you are the first person that I've talked to in this space that I'm like, I want to do that.
Yep.
That's it. Uh, Screw the numbers. I want to help people, and helping people, the finances will be there. I don't know if you've ever heard of Myron Golden
Yep.
before.
Yep.
I mean, he's an old West Virginia boy just like me. I'm originally from West Virginia, but he talks about, just like getting obsessed with solving people's problems and you'll never struggle for money ever again. And
Yep.
it's like, that's where I want to be, man. Humble servant. I want to help people make it. I want to help them succeed. I want them to be what I said about you today. You as you ought to be.
Mhm.
That's righteousness. And we live in a culture today that is the antithesis of that and forming us to be the antithesis of that. And so, man, I love your heart. I love what you're doing. And I'm like, if you do another podcast with me or not, I just want to be your friend.
Oh,
Uh,
bro, I'm not joking. No, I am the one thing that God has made me as a man of integrity. When I say it, it is set in stone. If you're like, we're doing 5 of them, I'm in. If you say we're doing 10 of them, I'm in. Like I will, we can have like weekly pastoral, former pastoral, entrepreneurial, pastoral sessions on customer journey mindset. Like I am in. I will literally do this with you as much as you desire. It's an honor.
Man, that is a blessing, and I'm gonna take you up on it, like, maybe we can get some kinda rhythm going
Yeah.
because I want to see this. I wanna see people answer the call of the entrepreneurial revolution. Like, I truly believe that. I'll tell you what I feel. I feel like we're in a moment where God is helping people break free from the systems that's robbing them of life. Okay.
Yep.
So you've got to come out of Babylon. You've got to come out of the educational system that's dumbed you down. You've got to come out of all of these basically making you a slave to the clock and possessions, because you can be a slave to a clock, but you can also be a slave to possessions. And slavery. It doesn't matter what you're enslaved to.
Yep.
And we've got to break free from those things. And the way forward is you operating at your highest degree of authenticity, which there has never been a greater time for you to be authentic and be in this creator economy than right now.
Yep.
And so I want to help people answer that call. But the thing that I'm really mindful of is, but I don't want them to get enslaved to money. I don't want them to get caught flexing and miss their wife, their kids. And so the way I look at wisdom, which this podcast is Wise Builders Business Community, like wisdom builds families, businesses, and communities. And I believe you're doing that, man. So what an honor to have you today. That's all I can say is what an honor to have you today.
Yeah, man, I feel the same. So this feels like a good time to wrap before I, have to run out and pee my pants. I'll own that too.
No, you're good,
And,
man. Thank you for
well,
your time. I appreciate it so much.